Running Sentences presents The Hapless Nomadic Cook, a series of fictional stories. Episode 1, Rocks. This is a work of fiction. Any and all names, characters, and places are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real, living, dead, people, places, things, objects is purely coincidental. This is meant to be a fictional story. It is not presented as a historical document on nomadic cooking and or historical items. It is merely here to ask the question, what happens and why? But do not take it seriously, as it is meant to be a fun, silly adventure. As our nomadic tribe finds a new place to settle down for camp, job selection comes up for election again through the tribal leader. Grubba, our little adventurer, hopes to avoid most jobs and fears being placed in a job with someone he does not like. Copyright 2021, Michael Honoré. All rights reserved. It was a nice day as the tribe wandered its way across the grassy fields. They had been moving for the last few weeks, heading where the chief pointed to in a solemn column that headed southward. The weather kept getting nicer, and the sounds of animals around them kept changing, as well as the insects. Now there was a sound of crashing, which meant that they were once again close to the big blue thing that touched the white soft ground, but never went further than that. Grubba liked this area, though it had been years since he'd last seen it. The noise and the cry of flying creatures also meant that the new election of jobs was coming, and that was not something he was looking forward to. The nomads emerged from the grassy field above onto a slightly clearer spot, and less grassy, that saw white dirt that greeted the big blue sheet of wet that sat near there, and caused all of the crashing noises. It was a pretty sight, and the people quickly moved from traveling to unpacking what they'd brought with them. Tents were soon popping up, and Grubba helped out where he could, though mostly sent away to help other people as nobody wanted him. The little community was soon set up, and even the big election ring of fire was soon established. Grubba's own tent was soon up, and he, along with the person he shared the tent with, Grubba, sat inside on the ground. Grubba, a big, tall man that never seemed to fit in any place that he tried to get comfortable in, sat there looking rather uncomfortable. Tents were never large enough. Caves always seemed too narrow for him, and he was just too big in general. Worse, he never stopped moving when he slept, and often rolled over and over until the tent came down. The only redeeming thing, Grubba thought, about Grubba was that the man was always away on hunts to gather food, and left him alone. The loud whistle from their leader, meaning gather around, rang through the camp, and Grubba rolled out of the tent, knocking it partially down onto Grubba before he could also get out. After a little bit of fussing, Grubba managed to get out after a knock on the head from a piece of wood that was holding the thing up. When he emerged from the wreckage of the tent, he was the last of the nomads hanging around the area. He hurried towards an area that was set up for the election, the ring of fire. A fire had already gotten going, and he could see it from the field where the tents had been placed on. They were on a hill overlooking other fields, which also had hills, and there was even a larger hill nearby, which had a tent already set up on it, which was probably Mugga's. Below, in front of him, sat the circle of his tribe gathering around the fire, and he heads towards it. The tribe was sitting around the roasting fire the afternoon, fading into the evening as they celebrated finding their new home for the next few weeks. Changes were, of course, coming to the land, as members of the tribe had already begun dragging wood and stone from the area so that they could use it to establish a better place. But now, as the leader Mugga stepped in front of the group, it was time to learn what jobs would be given out. Grubba sat near the back, not wanting to draw attention and hoping just to be forgotten about like he had been for their last home. He'd gotten to explore and find all sorts of spots, but sadly it had all been ruined by Vaka, an imp of a man who loved food, but also loved exploring and telling on people, because he knew the great and grand leader. I want you all to come forward one by one, and I will assign you jobs this time around. We had too many people not working at our last home. We can't have that if we're going to survive." Grubba groaned inwardly at the news. There was no escape now, and he certainly wouldn't be put in for hunting duty, as the last time he'd done that he'd been forced to run away from an animal he'd cornered because it looked innocent. That had gotten him quite a scolding from the tribe, and like many other jobs where he'd been chased away from this and that left one single one that he hadn't done yet. Cook. He glanced about, feeling the presence of a member of the tribe he didn't want to deal with. Vaca, the man who always seemed to be up for something and trying things, staring at him. He spotted the man approaching him and stood up. "Lord, higher up on the tribe, I'll go first." "Well, that's very nice of you, Grubba, but we are going to start nearer to me and not back where you are." Grubba ignored this as he hurried forward to get away from Vaca. Having made his way up to the tribal leader, he came to a stop in front of him, trying to look important. However, one look told Grubba that it was not in his best interest to have shown up today. "Grubba, you have been selected as a cook." No. What about Scout? There are many tribes that are going to be in the area. I'm sleek and fast and love to explore and can find them. We already have people who will take that job. If you've done any job at the past home, then we might have been able to give you a scouting job. You, however, are a cook this time. Do that job, and maybe at the next place you can be a scout. Toodles. At least tell me that Vaca isn't working as a cook this time. And what is wrong with Vaca? He likes to explore everything and doesn't know when to stop. Well, he sounds exactly like you. Thus, you two are the main cooks for the hunt returns and any big events we might have. Now, if you will get out of the way, I have more jobs to give out." Mugga pushed Grubba away, and then, shocked and disappointed, Grubba went wiltingly away. There was no point in going against the leader, as he was the leader, and the people generally disappeared from the tribe if they went against the leader. He could only trudge away from the fire with Vaca shadowing him in the background. His legs carried him away from the leader and the fire circle, and all of the election. It wasn't much of an election this time around, but his mind refused to register that thought as he walked away. He found himself not heading for his tent, but the blue water that crashed into the land. At the very least, it would provide some quiet. The sea crashed into the sand over and over and over again. The scent and smell of the place was relaxing to Grubba, who felt further away from the part of the tribe than he'd ever been. He hadn't grown up with this tribe, but had been found, and they claimed that they'd found him at a raided camp and taken him in under the orders of Mugga. The thought wasn't a pleasant one, and he didn't want to think of camps and death. He'd seen a few in his time as a soldier defending this tribe, at least the one time he'd been ordered to do that, and he'd run across a body that had scared the crap out of him, and he'd once again run away. In all that calmness, Grubba failed to notice that Vaca had come up behind him and then slapped him on the back. "Grubba, we'll be working together." "What? Oh, no, God, no." "Yes, we will." "No, I Grubba could only shake his head. "No, I mean, you shouldn't come up behind me. It was a shocking thing. And what are you holding? Please tell me you haven't found things again." "Oh, yes. You remember when I found those gray things? And I tasted them, and I forced you to taste them. And they looked like they should taste good, but no matter what we did to them, they were always hard, and well, no one could eat them." "No, you're not bringing rocks back to eat to these people again. No one will eat them." "But these are different ones. They taste even a little bit better." To this, Grubba ignored the man and turned to head back towards the election circle fire. The sight was no more appealing than standing next to this man. But still, he needed to get away, and so he started walking down the beach. Grubba, are you heading somewhere?" Grubba stopped and thought about this for a second, as of course he didn't have an answer other than to get away, and he could not just say that. Not because it would be rude or such things. He could. He just didn't have the words to express this thought. Actually, I'm headed back to my tent. It fell over, and I have to fix it before it gets too dark. You keep experimenting with those gray things, and I will see you tomorrow morning as a cook. Oh, okay. Free of Vaca, Grubba used this chance to hurry his way back towards his new tent, because it really did need to be set up once again. The sun was sadly all the way down by the time he managed to get back to his. What he found was a mess of sticks and animal hide all folded in on one another. Working in the dim moonlight, he rearranged the tent so that it was once again standing, though how well it would hold up he couldn't tell. There was no light to see, really. With that built up, he crawled into his tent towards the grassy bed of straw that was now laying on the ground in a disorganized fashion, strewn all across the tent floor. He soon, however, didn't care as he fell fast asleep with the worry of eating rocks taking over his imagination and dreams. It was a fitful sleep that was interrupted by the tent once again falling down on top of him and banging him in the head. Grubba was also then abruptly dragged out of the bed shortly after this by his tent mate. But it wasn't just his tent mate, Grubba, who had pulled him out, but Vaca was there as well in the early morning sun. The two looked rather disappointed that he was still not fully awake in the bright sunlight of the morning.
Grubba, you have work to do. Why do you still sleep?
Because I need it. What's going on?
There's a send-off for the hunters. Food is needed.
Vaca, having not let go of Grubba's leg, had gripped it extra hard and began dragging him off. Come, we must hurry to where the cooking fire is being set up. It took a bit of kicking for Grubba to free his leg from the grip of Vaca, who didn't seem to want to give it up. But he got it free and then scrambled to his feet to stop any further dragging efforts. Grubba glared at the man who had been dragging him from his tent towards the grassy field near the water. Vaca, why did you decide to drag me? Oh, I was just eager to get started. It's been a while since I've been working with someone, and they've set up this next fire. We need to hurry. Vaca, having not waited around for him, as he was always eager or ready to go, was moving away further and further towards something. Grubba slowly followed behind him. The little tent town was being revitalized as a more permanent encampment, with sturdier tents being built up as well as structures for the nomads to work out of. He made his way past all of this to where the cook hut had been built. It was a simple square place with a fire placed in the middle, and loads of odds and ends that would allow them to cook, all placed on split log stumps. A fir hide was stretched out over the top of 4 pegged logs that held up the hut that was going to be the cook hut. The hide was stretched out over the top of this to provide a little cover, but the hut itself was mostly open to the elements and had a few holes in the roof. There were reports that the last time that they used a covering for this hut, that it had caught fire, so these quick escape holes to prevent such things had been made. But Grubba had doubts about how true this story was. Regardless of that, though, Vaca was already inside, running around, picking up things, and looking them over carefully as he looked like he wanted to lick them. To this, Grubba hurried in to put a stop to this silly sight. Upon stepping inside, though, Grubba could smell the fire and whatever was too close to it. He jumped over to the roaring pit of smoke and flames to see that something now blackened had been stuffed next to the fire. It didn't smell awful, but there was something of an odor that went with this place. Grubba glared over at Vaca, who was busy with something that looked like meat. Vaca, what is this? Vaca turned and looked to see what was being pointed at. Oh yes, it was an experiment to see what happens. Vaca, we don't have food to experiment with. Not until a tribe hunt and foraging party. We have yet to have them return yet, or see off the hunting party. Vaca nodded and hurried over to try and pick up the burnt food out of the fire. It was, however, hot, and he juggled the food trying to get it out, but dropped both the items he was holding back into the fire. "Stop that, it's gone, we can't get them back." "But I told you to stop wasting food and not to grab it out of the heat. Listen, I'll tend to the fire and work here, and you can go to the foraging party to see what else there is in the area. You love to find things to cook with, and you could find more of those whatever you found the other day." "Oh, I heard some rumors that interesting stuff there in the area by the old lady Baba. No, don't tell me, Vaca. I want to be surprised by it. Just please go." Vaca nodded and bounded out of the cook hut, and was soon gone from sight, but he could still be heard shouting things. "I'm here to help the gatherers. Where are the gatherers gone? Where are the gatherers gone off to?" With that settled, Grubba turned to his supplies of food and cooking elements. There was some meat and some green things on the nearby split log. Not much for a cook to cook with, but the meat, which tasted better when it was put into a fire for long enough, was fun. The green things, though, they could just be left alone. But it would be nice to do something to them, just to give them a little something more. There was, however, nothing to put on them, so he settled for putting the meat to the fire to brown it enough to see how long he would need to cook it for. Grubba would emerge from his cocoon of cooking in the cook hut, where he'd finished his job of cooking meat for the hunting party that was having a send-off event. He then brought what he could to where the hunting party was having its annual send-off meeting, the fire election circle gathering area. He caught snippets of the latest, greatest plan to conquer some big beast, but mostly ignored what was going on since food needed to be carted over to the hunters. After having spent most of the morning cooking the food and drying others out so that they'd last for a little while, the party had taken their cuts and dividing it up amongst themselves and departing into the evening, heading off away from the village so that they could set off in the early morning. Grubba sat down heavily on a nearby rock near the election fire, which was not going. It had been a tiring morning and afternoon working away, and just by himself, and he hadn't gotten anything to eat either. The tribe always comes first if you want it to stay around. A few hurried shouts from nearby got him to his feet as he wandered towards it to see what was going on. Grubba had just managed to make it to the sandy beach when he was greeted by the sight of returning foragers, some of them with arms filled with berries, and others had with them fish. They all seemed to be headed right for him. Vaca, however, was not among them as they came up. Another of the tribe members, by the name of Slug, being the first to reach him with her girthy arms. "Food." "Good, yes, good. Drop them into the cook hut until we can establish the storage hut and so on." I don't mean to sound odd, because usually the hunting party takes care of the flapping creatures and bringing them in, but, how did you..." Slug merely looked at him. "They practically jumped into our arms from another body of water, a big one, nearby, cuts through the woods." "That's great. We'll have a feast with those. One last thing, though. Where's Vaca?" "Off somewhere. He's looking at small rocks that he so likes." "Oh, I see." By this point, the foragers had moved past him towards the cook hut and up above onto the grasslands off of the beach. Grubba watched the wide array of food and things that could provide a bit of energy, but were no meal alone, go past him. When he got back to the hut, there was plenty of new food being piled up and around the place, all of which would have to be prepped and cooked if it could be, soon. Nothing would be wasted, but there have to be much experimentation done to see what tasted like what. He just stuck his hand in some hard round things that tasted a bit sweet when bitten into, when ouch. Another of the tribe members came in. "Mugga wishes to see you." "About what, ouch?" "Don't know, come on." With a shrug, Grubba pulled his hand away from the fruits and vegetables and did his best to ignore the gurgling his body was doing. They'd headed over for the leader's tent, which sat above the rest on a hill overlooking the rest of the little temporary village that was transforming into a permanent one, although not entirely permanent. There was work being carried out around the entire village, including the leader's hut, to make things much more suitable and nicer. But currently it was all just a few logs being set up, with dirt being hurried and rushed about the place. Grubba managed to clamber up the hill after Ouch to see all this early work and stopped to find Mugga and Vaca sitting on the ground overlooking the hill. Grubba stopped for a second and stared. It was never a good sign when Vaca went and did things on his own. Mugga, however, had noticed him and waved him over, so there was no more of hiding in broad daylight.
Grubba, food!
What? Food! Vaca? I think he wants to know how things are going. Fine, why?
I'm just checking up on matters.
We need to decide.
There's been some murmurs about a vote to expel all tribal members who don't fit in and do their jobs. Also, one must work with their assigned groups. Failure to do that... Let's see. Vaca, could you join me down at the cook hut? Now, please?
Without waiting, Grubba turned and headed back down the hill, with Vaca jumping up from his spot and heading down after him. At the bottom of the hill, Vaca caught up with him, and they headed through the village. It was turning from tents into small structures that would provide a little bit better cover for sleep. And as would generally happen, these tents would fall apart because the wood was old, and it just made it easier to build new and better places to sleep than a dreary tent when you had fresh wood.
You'll never guess what I found.
Gray rocks.
But these ones aren't gray.
Good for them. I guess show them to me once we get into the cook hut, and any ideas you might have to get rid of the greenery foods that we have to deal with. Or just a way to make them taste better. Vaca was busily looking around for the rocks which he'd managed to drop somewhere, and he hurried off to find where they'd gone. Grubba failed to notice this, and as he was busy turning off his mind and heading straight for the cook hut to get more cooking done for the evening meal, he got back to the cooking fire to see that it was still going effectively, and turned to see that Vaca was nowhere to be seen. Oh, where did he go now? As he moved to head back out of the hut, though, he caught sight of Vaca hurrying with his hands full of something towards him. This caused Grubba to feel funny at the sight, like there was something terribly wrong, but what it was he could not say. He turned to pay attention to what he could do, and instead of paying attention to Vaca, as something was definitely going to not make him happy. After a few seconds of staring at some food until the footsteps of Vaca reached him, Grubba was torn on what to do. I found something I think you'll like. Grubba turned and looked at the small rock things in Vaca's hands. They were gray and white, like many little rocks that he'd come across. Vaca, please tell me those aren't just stones.
They're similar, but different.
You've been tasting them again, haven't you?
It's different than the usual ones, though.
How, Vaca? The man held them up to Grubba's eye level to make him get a better look, but there really wasn't anything to look at. Didn't really look all that special to begin with.
They have a pungent taste, Grubba. It's like other stones that I tried, but much more powerful. It's great to have. Just try one.
Before Grubba could complain, Vaca had forced a small stone into his hand. Then the man turned and dropped the rest of them onto some nearby food.
I'm going to find some more. Trust me on this.
With that, Vaca hurried off, leaving Grubba standing with the stone in his hand. He idly dropped it and turned his attention to trying to get some food to fend off his own hunger and figure out what would work to keep the rest of the tribe happy, as cooking needed to be done. Later that evening, a line had formed outside of the hut as evening fell upon the new little campsite.
Grubba had found himself busy doling out what food had been collected and made sure that everyone had enough for the night and the morning next. All of the greenery, of course, was given away first. Then the last of the meats. It was exhausting work without Vaca around, and of course he ignored the rocks that had been brought over. There was no time to play with rocks, at least until the handouts were done. When he was finally done with all of this, though, all he could do was lean against the exterior of a nearby pole holding up the cook hut, and relax as he slid down it to rest his tired eyes and his tired body. "Did you try it?" Grubba found his eyes coming back open as the sprightly Vaca was right in front of him, staring at him. The man cocked his head to the side and looked pleadingly at him. "Did I what?" "The thing I found. Did you try it?" "I haven't had a chance, Vaca. I've been busy cooking, which you're supposed to be helping with." "Let's try it. I found a new way to use it already." Vaca hurried into the hut while Grubba struggled to get back up to his feet to see what was going on. Eventually he managed to get up and to see that Vaca was smashing stone against stone. Because of this, the small little stones were turning into a white-gray dust. Vaca grabbed up a handful and held it up for Grubba to see. It looked just like gray, dusty dirt. "What's that?" "A fine new item to eat." It doesn't." "Try it. Lick it. Lick the rock." Grubba found himself grabbing a little bit of the dust from Vaca's hand. He stared at it in his fingers, and as Vaca stared at him eagerly, he finally put some in his mouth. A shock of taste between bitter, sweet, and sour flooded into his mouth, and with just this little taste, his mind revolted and couldn't figure out what to do. So he dropped the remaining dust from his fingers and stood there, staring off into the distance. "Isn't it amazing, Grubba?" "It was something? I don't think I know how to express how bad that was." "Yeah, but if we take just a small bit of it, it should make everything better. You wanted a way to make foods better. This could do it." Vaca was already up and about, sprinkling the dust onto a piece of meat, and then lowering it towards the still-going fire. Grubba had broken out of his stupor in time to see this, and blanched. No, that's my... It's fine. Just a few minutes. All the sides with this ingredient, with this stuff, and the experiment will be finished." "But my..." They fell quiet as the meat cooked for a few minutes. Once it had achieved a nice color, Vaca pulled it back and threw a bit more rock dust onto it, and turned to Grubba. "What do you think?" "It looks like it usually does, which I suppose is nice." "Right, so it can't be bad, can it?" They let the food cool for a minute, watching it to see if anything further was going to happen. When nothing did, and it was easy enough to pull the meat off of the bone and the stick that had been cooked on, Vaca split the meat in two with his hands, holding out a piece for Grubba. "Enjoy! I gotta go back to my tent. Bye!" Vaca then disappeared with his piece of meat in his mouth from the hut, while this left Grubba standing there with his half in his hands. Too tired to think about much, Grubba resigned himself to heading for his own little tent that was still up, with his food. On his way back to his tent, Grubba, having had such a rough day of it all, and not wanting to think any more, stared at his food while he headed back. Sleep was more on his mind than food, and at least his tent partner wouldn't be around, having gone off for the hunt. His stomach, however, grumbled and complained about the lack of food, and the still warm meat in his hand did look tempting. He found himself biting into it before he knew what he was doing. A sudden depth of flavor coming at him, but it was overpowering. It was too much. He staggered about, trying to decide if the original flavor was still there. He picked at the food a little bit more and wandered back towards his tent, trying to figure out if this was good or not, with those little rocks having been sprinkled on it. He was still thinking about it the next morning, trying to figure out if his mouth was dry because of the food,
or if it was just that way normally. He'd taken a few sips of water to quench that away, but the food, the meat that had been so different, was different and confusing. Perhaps it needed a little less of that rock, but could work, and if it impressed others, then maybe it would impress Mugga. The taste certainly could cause a stir. Grubba looked about the cook hut for Vaca, but the man was nowhere to be seen, though several rocks were about the place. He set about seeing if he, too, could crush the rocks to produce a similar result. After a few harsh minutes of pounding rock on rock on rock, he had a small amount of the stuff on a rock, and he was rather pleased that he could manage to do this, though now that the experiment was done, and no one else was around, he wondered if he should take it any further by putting this rock substance on other foods. A glance towards the fire made him realize, though, that it hadn't been started, and with a sigh he abandoned his newfound item and plaything to get that started. He spent the rest of his morning moving the needed wood from the supply area to the cook hut, a slow process of dragging a few logs to and from their locations. Then, getting the fire started and had taken up much of his time, as it didn't seem to want to catch this morning. The only good part in all of this was that the food given out last night should have lasted the tribe until the morning, when they would go off to do their respective jobs. He was so busy hoping that the foragers would find something new and different that he failed to notice that Vaca was busy in the cook hut organizing things next to him, even though he was just outside dragging another log in. He stopped once he got near the fire, and finally noticed that the man was there, and stared at him. "Vaca, how much of those stones do you have?" "Not many. I found them in a dark hole in the floor. I can try and get some more if you want." No, for now, hold off on that. And don't tell anyone about this stuff. We don't want the tribe to know that we're changing things about, because they tend to jump on things, and it just ends badly for everybody. "But they should know." Grubba glared at him and turned and tended to the fire, stoking it with a stick to get the wood to burn. "No. If we do so, our little leader, our great grand leader, will try and take it away. We must introduce this slowly, and when we secure enough of it and know enough about it. To do that, though, we have to experiment, something you love to do." "I can do that." Yes, you can. Good. And it's all good. You get to getting that rock all crushed up and in a nice pile on another rock, and I'll deal with these green things that should get around to be given names, but we don't really bother with that. But they're not really that great either, so I don't really want to. Vaca was ignoring him as he set about crushing rocks. Grubba turned to dealing with his stuff. The two worked hard getting the green ingredients ready, sprinkling them with rock, and tasting them to see if they changed, which they had a little bit, but also cooking them on a stick and sprinkling them all around with the rock to see if it would change things even further. It was all tasty, better than tasty. It made him feel like his mouth appreciated what it was to be alive. The day would pass much like this, with a few drop-offs from foragers and workers seeking out some snacks and food. They were given other samples, though, and not any of the stuff with the rocks sprinkled on it. Though there was some curiosity about what they were doing, but no one bothered them. They got lost in their work for the day. By the time evening rolled around, the line had begun to form to get food supplies for the night. The hunting party had not yet returned and wouldn't be back for another day or two. Grubba, with the help of Vaca, busily helped hand out food that had been foraged for. The last person through the line that night was Mugga, who looked concerned at them. He signaled that they should all go off to the side and away from one another, and the other lingering tribe members who were snacking away on their foods while talking. Just out of hearing of those lingering around, Mugga fixed them with a heavy stare. Grubba glanced over at Vaca, who didn't notice or care that the leader wanted something. That was the power of being associated with a family of higher-ups, Grubba assumed. "What's this stuff you've discovered?" "Vaca, I told you not to tell anyone."
Well, Mugga isn't exactly anyone. He keeps the tribe going, and well, Grubba, tell me what this stuff is. All I could get out of Vaca, that it was a rock. Well, that is what it is. It's crushed rock, but it tastes like the big water nearby, or similar, but it goes with almost everything, and it makes your mouth go crazy, I think. And why are you trying to hide this? Grubba tried to signal for the leader to keep his voice down, but Mugga's attitude towards such things never went the way one wanted. Because we only have so much that Vaca has found, and it's almost all gone now except for small samplings. Mugga grabbed his arm and headed straight towards the cooking hut. Once inside, the leader began looking wildly about for the crushed rock. But not knowing what he was looking for, he ran around the small space and the dying flames of fire without finding anything. Grubba looked down at the small bit of crushed rock on rock and gently picked it up between his fingers. Sir, this is all we have left. To this, Mugga ran over and tried to eat Grubba's fingers, while Grubba, of course, tried to get away from the crazed leader who was now trying to eat his fingers. He succeeded in getting his hand away, but only because Mugga looked so surprised, and his jaw had dropped open upon tasting what was held in Grubba's hand. Taking this chance, Grubba, of course, fled. Getting out of the cook hut, ran directly into Vaca, who had remained where he was from the little meeting. Escape is our only option. The leader's gone mad. Vaca looked at him with a raised eyebrow, and then over at the hut where a very mad-looking Mugga emerged from. The leader looked like he was ready to chew something, anything, as long as it had crushed rock on it. More. That was the last of it, and if you want any more of it, you'll need Vaca to go get it. He's the one keeping the secrets. Grubba then pushed Vaca towards the leader and turned and fled his way towards his tent, hoping that this was all just some sort of odd thing that his mind had put together. When he crawled out of his tent the next morning, Grubba was greeted in his still sleepy state by tribal members dragging things on pelts through the little tent village that was turning into a little hut village. Piled on them were gray, white stones. He looked about confused as the lines of the members of the tribe carried their load towards the cook hut. He blinked a few times and then got to his feet and hurried towards the hut. When he arrived outside, there stood Mugga, looking very delighted with his new treasures that were being dumped in front of him. The pile of rocks that added so much taste to food were being dumped on the ground around him, and around the cook hut. Grubba saw that Vaca was busily inside the hut, crushing up stone, and then grabbing the handfuls and dumping it on whatever food he could find. Grubba feared for the food that it was just going to be bad. But then a voice broke through all of this. The hunting party is returning. A few villagers were around that were paying attention all turned their attention away from the piled rocks and headed for the wooded field nearby. Grubba tried to head for the cook hut. However, he was swept up in the rush to go help the hunters bring in their catch. But not before he saw Mugga looking far too gleeful at the news and grabbing up a rock as he too headed for the fields. The tribe hurried out to the nearby field near the wood which the hunters were coming from. A ragged and tired-looking group greeted them with waves and some shouts of glory as they had tried to drag 4 big beasts that they'd managed to bring down and were now bringing back. The tribe members rushed to help grab the dead creatures and bring them into the camp, and help alleviate the load that the hunters had been dragging with them. Grubba, having found himself roped into the mess, was now helping to grab a hold of one of these animals, with a little bit of ickiness since it was a dead animal, and then helped carry it into the little village, though not feeling like he was doing that much, since everybody else felt like they were doing more, and he had only grabbed the leg of one of these creatures. The transportation of the animals stopped at a tent that was being turned into a hut. There they would be chopped up, but for now they would be rested there next to this hut. A group of the tribe had already set to work trying to figure out how to get at the meat, and a sight of that never looked great to Grubba, so after helping to drop off the animal that he'd sort of but not really helped carry, he ran off to the safety of his workspace. The only problem was that he could clearly see that Mugga was now back there, looking happily over his pile of rocks that he seemed to be crowding over. Grubba marched into the cook hut, doing his best to ignore the chief, who was holding up a rock with glee. Vaca, who was nearby stoking a fire and had another 2 fire pits going and roaring off in the back, was busy with that. To this, Grubba could only look for something to do, and took to sorting out a few greens that were left over, since no one had bothered to gather up this morning's foraging parties. After a few minutes of this, and the first leg of meat was brought over, which caused Mugga to drop his stones and rush over to accept it for them. When Mugga came into the hut, he had a gleaming look about him as a shiny new prize. "Prepare the rocks!" To this news, Vaca jumped up from his fire and hurried over to a nearby pile of rocks that had been set just to the side. He picked up 1 or 2 of them, and then went over to another rock, where he proceeded with the process of crushing it up so that he could dust it with the required rock dust. Mugga waited nearby for the process to be completed, desperately clutching this leg of meat. While waiting, though, he also grabbed a small rock that had fallen by the wayside in the grass, and picked it up and plopped it into his mouth. And then, as if it was doing nothing to him, went back to holding the meat out for Vaca. Grubba could only shake his head and went about sorting the greens, though his mouth took a bit of dryness to it. The air circulating about this little hut with rock dust was getting a bit much, and he decided he needed to escape, or at least quench his thirst. He looked about for a nearby leaf bucket. He found 2 empty ones near the fire and grabbed them both so that he could fetch some water. It took a while for Grubba to find a stream of fresh water, having gotten lost in a few attempts to head out into the woods. Having gotten lost on a few attempts to head into the woods, and having to return to the village to find his way. Eventually he got one of the foragers to help point him in the right direction, and he set off to find some water and fill his buckets. And when he finally arrived at this water, first though he doused his mouth in water, drinking up as much as he could stomach, get rid of this dry feeling and taste, before turning to fill his buckets and head back to town. Getting back to the little village was a little easier than finding the drinkable water. Grubba was at least thankful for that, and soon found his way back to the cooking hut, although upon entering and seeing the sheen of grey-white rock that plastered over everything, he soon felt a tinge of regret that he'd come back. A cloud of the stuff almost instantly dried his mouth, and he backed out. He wandered around back to find that 2 fires had been started nearby, and many of the tribe members were round these fires, holding hunks of meat attached to sticks and bones, roasting the meat coated with rock. The sight caused him to lick his lips, which only reminded Grubba that he'd just walked through the cloud of rocks in the cook hut, and now that was all he could taste. Desperate to rid himself of that feeling, he grabbed a bucket and doused himself in cool water, washing away some of the sensation. But it took the whole container to do so, and he looked sadly at the sight of the empty bucket, then at his still full one. And then he looked at the crowd. There would be much need for the drink, and he slowly plodded off to find any baskets and buckets that might be able to hold water, for there would be much need, he figured. He would spend his evening finding ways to taxi the liquid from the stream to the village, carrying the water he could to the party. The tribe had mostly taken to ignoring him as they feasted on food and celebrated the return of the hunters. The only time Grubba was paid attention to was when the buckets were grabbed out of his hands. Eventually, though, he had had enough and found his way to his own tent and crawled in as best he could because his tired arms didn't want to cooperate with crawling. The morning came about all too soon for Grubba, who came out of his tent to the election fire area. There he found it filled with tired and exhausted tribal members who had such a good time that they were sleeping where they were last night was better than trying to get back to their little tents. It was a warm night last night, so it wouldn't have been that hard to fall asleep at any such location. Grubba himself having fallen victim to the warm night, and having had the same thing happen to him the second he'd got into his tent. But that wasn't fully on his mind when he spotted Mugga getting up tiredly and looking about for something. To this, Grubba hurried over and yanked the leader to his feet and away from the crowd towards the beach. He also grabbed a bucket of water from the nearby cook hut and glanced over to see if it was still dusted in rock before moving over and dragging Mugga away from the mast into a nearby field. He handed the bucket over to the leader, who drank it greedily. "Ah, I needed that. Thank you, Grubba." "You're not welcome. Listen, if we use this stuff, we need someone working in a separate building from the cook hut. Also, we cannot pour it just all over food." "Why not?" Grubba pointed towards the election fire area, where the withering and waking members of the tribe were now just getting up. They'd all looked like they'd been put through quite a lot and were jumping on any bucket nearby, only to find it empty of water. That happens. They need water. Now I shall be in control of this item until we can get a better understanding of what it is and how to use it. No more pouring it onto everything. I'm the leader. I get to say what goes. Well, I'm the cook, appointed by you. And if you want your food your way, please reassign me to any other job. With that, Grubba turned away and headed for the cook hut to clean up. End of episode 1. Thank you for listening.